God really seems to like making sequels. They're sprinkled all through the Bible. Abraham and Sarah are too old to have a child until God acts and they have Isaac, God's promise for a future fulfilled. One generation later, Rebekah is barren, and then God intervenes again to produce another miraculous child. The next generation, Rachel, surprise, has the same trouble, and after her husband manages to father like 6 children from 3 other baby mamas, God acts again in the same miraculous way. This happens all through the Bible, so that by the time you get to Mary giving birth to Jesus in the biggest manless miracle of all, you're kind of like, yeah, I saw the original. Or take food in the Bible. The Israelites starve in the desert. God sends them manna from heaven. They get tired of eating vegetarian, so a buffet of quail falls to their dinner tables. A widow is famished in a famine, and Elijah, who is also really hungry, tells her to use her last remaining flour to bake him a cake. And boom, the food multiplies. By the time Jesus multiplies loaves and fishes and turns water into wine, you're kind of like, yeah, I saw that coming. God really loves making sequels. Today we have another one. Joshua, charged with stepping into the enormous shoes of Moses, comes to his own body of water, not the Red Sea that trapped Moses with Pharaoh in hot pursuit, but the Jordan River at flood stage. A river standing in the way of the people and their promised homeland. And God says, remember that miracle that I did when the waters parted and the people passed over on dry land? Let's do that one again. Now, part of this miracle at the Jordan is in fact new. Sure, crossing this river is similar to crossing the Red Sea, but the terrain is totally different. If you're standing there at the Jordan, you aren't going to see any Red Sea landmarks to show you the way. The leaders are different too. These are all debut appearances by the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Never seen any of them before. And this is Joshua's first time starring in a leading role. The stakes are different too. The people crossing the Red Sea were running from slavery, running from Pharaoh. For them, the end of slavery was on the other side of the sea. Joshua's folks are crossing into enemy territory. Their story is just beginning. Part of this miracle at the Jordan is new. It's the movement of the crossing. The movement of the crossing, the action that makes this story feel like a rerun. The need for courage is entirely the same. The risk of trusting in your leader's testimony, telling you that God has promised to make a way where there is no way, that's the same. The faith needed to believe that God can get you through this is entirely the same. And part of me is kind of disappointed. I mean, I saw the first Fast and Furious movie like 20-some years ago. It was fine, but did we really need 9 more after that? Same with James Bond, Mission Impossible, Star Wars, and Marvel Studios. I mean, after a while, you know where the storyline is headed. You want to see something novel, exciting, surprising. But as I reflect on where we are in the world today, our church does seem positioned more like a possible sequel than starting something new. George Floyd's murder and 100 other racist episodes in the last several years have reminded us that we haven't escaped the racialized scripts that have been present with us since Europeans first arrived to these shores. The climate may be changing rapidly before us, but the question of whether we are going to cooperate together for the benefit of all, or suffer together for the benefit of a tiny, wealthy few, well, that script has been with us since the first empires emerged thousands of years ago. The war between Israel and Hamas might look different than it has ever looked before, with so many advanced weapons added now to the mix. But the conflict over this land has been going on for a long, long time. And the need for moral courage for leaders to stand into this place and put the well-being of children and their future front and center, well, that plot line has never gone away. There is nothing particularly new about any of these scripts. The only thing that is different is the people who are now filling the roles. We are the ones now living in a world that can't seem to learn its lessons about the futility of war. We are the ones living in a nation that hasn't learned to face the truth of its past. We are the ones watching the creatures of the earth suffer from our lack of action. The questions for the church and for us as a congregation aren't really all that different from the questions the church has been called to respond to in the past. How will we respond to God's call to make our communal life together a demonstration of what cooperation looks like among a group of individuals, each with our own perspective, our own issues, our own problems? Will we be an incubator of peace here in a nation dripping with violence, a world on fire with war? Will we educate ourselves on the history of hate in this country and the building blocks of repentance, truth, and reconciliation so that we have something significant to offer to our children and to the world? And even more personally, will we be there for each other, holding the pain of loss, heartache, and hurt at a time when the everyone for themselves mentality is feeding the pockets of the gun industry and the there's an app for that explosion that's leaving us all more alone? Those questions aren't particularly new for the church as a people. The landmarks may seem different because, of course, none of us has been this particular way before, in this particular place, with these particular landmarks. We can look to our ancestors who fought for some of these same things, but their fight was colored by the particulars of their time. Now, there is an argument, alive and well, that our times are totally unprecedented, especially for the church. And in some ways that is true. The assumption used to be that everyone went to a church or synagogue. Now the assumption is that no one does. That makes all of you odd, by the way. The assumption used to be that Sunday mornings were reserved for worship on the public calendars. Now those public calendars reserve Sunday morning for soccer games and pre-Ravens tailgating. It used to be that this grand facility had the deep pockets of many, many wealthy people who helped to build it, to install the most grand Tiffany windows, the incredible chancel, the finest organ, and the most reliable boiler, such that I imagine the church never ever worried about paying its own bills. In that sense, it is different. It is very, very different. But in the whole sweep of the Christian story, those differences could also be seen as relatively minor. The core questions of our faith and world haven't changed much at all. Are we as human beings capable of doing more than sinking our own ship that we're all sailing on together? Are we capable of overcoming the violence in our hearts and the hate that we create to support it? Are we able to find connection with the divine and with each other in the loneliness that is so much of our everyday living? Is there a purpose to it all for any of us and for all of us together? And how will I use this moment in my life right now? Will I use it to feed my own defense against my fear of not being loved or of not finding purpose? Or will I risk it to listen to my neighbor's suffering and yearning and carve out a sacred connection that would bring me closer to wholeness and even leave God pleased? But I'm probably overthinking these things. Standing at the Jordan, I doubt those priests in these debut roles are contemplating existential questions about what this moment might mean to them. The Lord has put before Joshua and all of them a much simpler question. Are you willing to get your feet wet? Are you willing to get your feet wet? I mean, I know Joshua directs the people to get their feet wet. It is a command. But I would be willing to bet that this simple question, am I willing to get my feet wet, is the one that is in the mind of every single one of them. Am I willing to stand in water and hold the possibility that with God's help it might just move? Am I willing to take just a few more steps and see where they might lead? Am I willing to cast my lot with a group of people who have a better chance of looking foolish or getting hurt or being dragged away by the currents of this time, this place, in this moment? Am I willing to get my feet wet? And look, each of you answering that question in the affirmative is the only thing that gives a congregation like this one any chance of a future. More importantly, it's the only way that miracles like this one ever happen. That part of the script never changes. Without people willing to get their feet wet, we've had no civil rights movement. Women would not have the right to vote. LGBTQ people would be 1,000 times more vulnerable to persecution than they are today. Closer to home, without people willing to get their feet wet, there'd be no small groups in this congregation, no lunch after church, no smiling faces greeting you at the door, no choir singing, no teachers teaching children, no handbells ringing, no deacons organizing compassion when any of us are in grief. No one to welcome our newest Afghan neighbors, no one to show up and hold you when you bury your dead. No trustees racing against the clock to restore heat to this place. You got to get your feet wet. This is the way renewal happens in the church, the same way that miracles happen in the public square when ordinary people like us get together with all of our pain and all of our yearning, with all of our foibles, and just take the next step. Get your feet wet, stepping into the uncertain future with confidence that comes from knowing what God has done with similar ordinary people in the past. Get your feet wet and see the hope that comes from knowing that God really does love making sequels. Get your feet wet and watch tyrants defeated, bread multiplied, and wine overflowing every cup. Get your feet wet and receive the future that is given to a people who could see no future before they took that first and second and third risky, faithful step.